when we last left Christiana and her companions, they had added another pilgrim to their party, an older man named Honest, and they came upon the house of Gaius, where they were able to stay for over a month. So we pick up the story once more with the pilgrims still resting in Gaius's house. And here we read of how Gaius employed Greatheart's service in ridding the land of a fearsome dragon named Slaygood, how they met another pilgrim named Feeble-mind, and how after leaving Gaius, they came to the town of Vanity and of what they found there. So our reading begins with the pilgrims all staying up through the night speaking with Gaius, for Gaius, and they were such suitable company that they could not tell how to part. Have you ever experienced evenings like that? I have had many such conversations, especially while doing mission work. In such moments, there's a shared connection that certainly does make sleep to be inconsequential, especially whenever a parting is fast approaching. I look fondly back upon those evenings well spent with brothers and sisters that I very likely shall not see again in this life. May we each have the privilege of meeting such brothers as Gaius upon our own journeys, and perhaps even more importantly, may we have the great privilege of being like Gaius to other brothers and sisters along their journeys. When Mr. Honest began to grow tired, Greatheart gave him a riddle to solve, and that then led to the discussion of two questions, and the first is what we'll discuss here. So, the question is posed like this. There were two men that went on pilgrimage. The one began when he was young, the other when he was old. The young man had strong corruptions to grapple with. The old man's ones were decayed with the decays of nature. The young man trod his steps as even as did the old one, and was every way as light as he. Who now, of which of them had their graces shining clearest, since both seemed to be alike? Honest then answered correctly by saying that the young man had the greatest opposition, and thus showed the best effort in striving against his sin. Now, older men ought to consider such things, so that they may not think of themselves more highly than they ought, right? And it also ought to be a comfort to younger men that war against fleshly desires, that will not always be so severe as those desires seem to be in the moment. Now later, Gaius made a proposal to go with Greatheart in search of a giant named Slaygood, that doth much annoy the king's highway in these parts. Thus Greatheart armed himself with his sword, shield, and helmet, and the other pilgrims went with him with spears and staves. And about this venturing forth to find and kill the giant, one writer makes this comment. He says, "It may be asked how far it is right to expose ourselves to danger and difficulties, since it is rashness, not courage, to expose ourselves to unnecessary danger, or to give unnecessary offense." And I would throw in, that's a good question to raise, right? He says, I would answer, it can never be improper to expose error, or to oppose a prevailing vice by which God's children are in danger of being beguiled, right? And so that is exactly what is happening here. Greatheart and his company found Slaygood, and they took off his head, and this adventure was indeed well spent, for the pilgrims rescued another pilgrim named Feeble-mind from being eaten by this giant, right? They didn't go for their own sake, they didn't go for self-glory, they went to rescue other pilgrims, right? So back in Gaius' home, the pilgrims entered into a discourse with Feeble-mind, and they learned that he came from the town of Uncertain. He was captured by the giant, but trusted that he would be delivered by the Lord. And in his thanksgiving for his rescue, Feeble-mind said, "For which I thank my king as author, and you as the means." I love that. This very much ought to be the manner of all Christian thanksgiving. Our God always deserves supreme praise as the author of all things by his steady working hand of providence. And our thanks to others ought to be genuine in acknowledging them as the means by which God has worked in our lives. Now, as we come to learn, Feeble-mind is the nephew of Mr. Fearing, which certainly explains the similarities between the two. We also learn that God's providence was even greater toward Feeble-mind than he first realized. A man named Not Right met with Feeble-mind and journeyed with him for some time, but ran away whenever Feeble-mind was captured by giant Slaygood. But as Feeble-mind sat in Gaius' house, a messenger brought word that Not-right had been struck dead by lightning. Here's a contrast between a feeble believer and a spacious hypocrite. The latter eludes persecutions by time-serving, yet perishes in his sins. The former suffers and trembles, yet hopes to be delivered and comforted. The frequency with which this is introduced and the variety of characters by which it is illustrated show us how important the author deemed such warnings. Now soon the pilgrims made ready to leave Gaius' house and resume their journey. Notably, Feeble-mind did not want to travel with Christiana's company, for he deemed himself too weak to walk alongside such pilgrims. It is here that in Feeble-mind's protests that we learn the nature of his feebleness. Feeble-mind represents the weak believer that Paul describes in places like Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 14. These are genuine believers whose conscience is weak and easily offended by many of the freedoms that other believers are able to enjoy. Spurgeon describes them well. He says, "The first thing for us to note is that there are some poor feeble-minded saints who really are not the best company, but who must not be slighted. They are not very cheerful. They may not even be amiable. They have feeble minds. You will not learn much from them. They are, as Bunyan says, very ignorant Christian men. But we ought not, as a church, to hesitate to have these added to us. We should be glad that they come amongst us." Now we should also take Greatheart's response to heart, that it would be our attitude toward these Christians as well. He says, "But, brother," said Mr. Greatheart, "I have it in commission to comfort the feeble-minded, to support the weak. You must needs go along with us. We will wait for you. We will lend you our help. We will deny ourselves of some things both opinionative and practical for your sake. We will not enter into doubtful disputations before you. We will be made all things to you, rather than you should be left behind." And how well can we learn from Greatheart? We should say, as the Apostle Paul said, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them." And likewise, taking care not to trouble weak believers is a part of counting others more significant than yourselves. Finally, as they made ready to leave, another pilgrim named Ready to Halt joined their company and offered to let Feeble-mind use one of his crutches. Now, Feeble-mind declines, since he is not yet lame, but remarks that he may use one of them if he comes upon a dog. Many have guessed as to what Bunyan meant to represent by Ready to Halt's crutches. Spurgeon thought that they were using written prayers rather than praying in one's own words. Another writer considered them to be the opinions and writings of other Christians. I think that both may be true, for I think that they represent anything outside of Scripture and community that a Christian uses to support himself. And yet Spurgeon's comments, I think, are fitting to heed. So he says, "Many saints have crutches, of one sort or another. They cannot trust their feet, and they have found them to be of some help to them, and they are generally willing to lend their crutches to others. It is quite right that it should be so. Now, come in, friend Ready to Halt, with your crutches. Come in, Mr. Feeble-mind, with all of your weakness and fears. You two will then take counsel together about the things of God. We will wait for you, and will not mind that we do so, so long as we can get to the same end together by and by." Now, after setting forth on their journey once more, the pilgrims came to the town of Vanity, and found it much changed since Christians' passage through. After the brutal martyrdom of faithful, the townsfolk had not so killed another pilgrim, and in many parts of the great city were even becoming friendly to Christians. So it often is that martyrs' blood changes the tide of culture gradually away from unthinking hostility toward believers. Thus the company found in Vanity another house in which to lodge, whose owner's name was Nason. Here Bunyan used the same name once again as a hospitable man within the Scriptures. So Acts 21:16 reads, "And some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Nason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge." So, while in Nason's house, more believers came to have fellowship with the pilgrims. Mr. Contrite, Mr. Holy Man, Mr. Love Saint, Mr. Dare Not Lie, and Mr. Penitent. And after discoursing with them for some time, they remained in Nason's house and became acquainted with more townsfolk. And yet, one evening, a monster came to town and slew many of the people in the town. It would also carry away their children and teach them to suck its whelps. Now, in another book, Bunyan wrote this: "This monster is Antichrist. The devil is the head, the synagogue of Satan is the body, the wicked spirit of iniquity is the soul. The devil made us of the church, the clergy, to midwife this monster into the world. He had plans in his dragon's mouth, and so came in by flatteries. He metamorphosed himself into a beast, a man or woman. And the inhabitants of the world loved the woman dearly, became her sons, and took up helmet and shield to defend her. She arrayed herself in flesh-taking ornaments, gold and precious stones like a harlot. She made the kings drunken, and they gave her the blood of saints and martyrs until she was drunken and did revel and roar. But when her cup is drunk out, God will call her to such a reckoning that all her clothes, pearls, and jewels shall not be able to pay the shot. The beast is compared to the wild boar that comes out of the wood to devour the church of God. The temporal sword will kill its body, but the spirit can only be slain by the Spirit. The Lord of the Spirit will slay its soul." So Bunyan no doubt saw this Antichrist as Catholicism, as did the rest of the Puritans and the Reformers before them. And so it was. Yet the spirit of Antichrist is always returning in some form or fashion. It is always rearing its head with the authority of the state behind it. And today I would argue that wokeism is Antichrist. And like other manifestations before it, it craves bringing children into it. After making the monster retreat, we learned that the monster, you must know, had his certain seasons to come out in and to make his attempts upon the children of the people of the town. Also, these seasons did those valiant worthies watch him in, and did continually assault him. Brothers and sisters, so ought we, particularly who are ministers or parents, so do. Let us valiantly watch for the monster that would love nothing more than to indoctrinate our children into itself. Let us watch, and let us ever cling to the sword of the Spirit for our victory. Thank you so much for listening. Until next week, grace and peace.